Here's another one by request. Apparently I'm taking requests now, so send them in. And this request goes all the way back in some ways to episode number 5 and the topic of creating customer consensus. So episode number 5 was all about the difference between what we call a collection of yeses versus a collective yes. The whole idea that you can't just get each individual stakeholder to look you in the eye and say, yes, I agree. You got to get them to agree with one another, thus connecting them not so much to you, but to each other. Now, the question today in the request is around the concept of multithreading. It's one of these concepts that's on everybody's mind today because, in fact, is the reality in virtually every one of the deals that we're all doing, which is how do I find a way to thread my way through all of those different stakeholders and ultimately then, of course, to connect them to each other. And the question wasn't so much, can you talk about it conceptually or in the abstract, but very tactically, practically, how the heck do I even make that happen? Because I think we'd all agree it's hard. How do I find a way to thread myself through the customer organization and connect to each one of those stakeholders? And I think in many times when we talk about multi-threading, that's what we think about doing. We think about, how do I connect with this person? Now, how do I connect with that person? Now, how do I connect with that person? How do I connect myself to that person, but my colleague to that person, and maybe my boss or my boss's boss to their boss's boss? And so we've got all these different threads from our side going into all those different threads from that side. That really is just still a collection of yeses in aggregate. The question we really need to solve, whether you call it multi-threading or not, is how do we do a better job of getting all of those different individuals inside the customer organization to figuratively, literally look each other in the eye and say, yes, this is a good course of action. This is our top priority problem to solve, or at least one of our top priority problems to solve. This is the best course of action in order to solve that problem, and this indeed is the right supplier to solve that problem with that solution. How do we make all that happen? Because it's really hard. And I think from a tactical or practical perspective, one of the best examples I've seen of companies doing this really well, in fact, I saw an example of a company just this week doing this really well, is something that I've come to call a customer alignment workshop or a stakeholder alignment workshop. And that is quite literally to get all of those different customer stakeholders, as many as possible, in a room or maybe on a call in the world we live in today, and literally have a conversation, but not have a conversation like the demo and let me show you all the cool bells and whistles of the cool capabilities I have, but rather it's a conversation among themselves that I am not so much presenting, but rather I am facilitating and creating an opportunity for them to compare notes on what they're even trying to do. So if you think about problem, solution, supplier, let's start with the problem. What are the different problems that we're trying to address as a company? How do those different problems break out into objectives and tactics and metrics and targets and timelines? And let's get alignment on them. So we parse that problem into its component elements. And each one of those steps, do we all agree that that is the right problem that we should be solving? It's in other words, do we all agree it's a problem? But then do we agree that it's a priority to solve that problem relative to all the other ways that we can employ our limited cost, our limited capital, our limited resources? And once we agree that that's a problem, how do we then break that problem into, all right, what are our objectives, again, and tactics, metrics, and targets, and timelines, and parse it out. And at each one of those steps, we've got to get those individuals to agree, yep, that's what we want to do. And so how does the physics of this actually work? All right, step one is we've got to get them to agree to even have this conversation in the first place. So ideally, inside of a deal, you've got a connection to what we traditionally might call a champion. I would call it a mobilizer, and there's a big difference between a champion and a mobilizer. Stay tuned in a future episode on that. But someone who is willing and able to get those people inside the customer organization at the table. And the first step in that, of course, is just to identify who they are. Who should even be involved in this conversation in the first place? And maybe you're leaning a little bit on that mobilizer to identify from their perspective who those people should be, but maybe you're actually guiding or coaching that mobilizer from your expertise, from your experience, or your collective company's experience in other deals, and suggesting who might also be at that meeting. But then we got to invite them. And so in the invitation, we've got to build out, it's probably an email, a reason for getting together. So here's an event. It's an hour-long call. It's a 4-hour session in person, whatever it might be, where we're going to get in a room and we're going to discuss this. And here's why this matters. Here's the business case, not for listening to this supplier or even having this event, but here's the business case for why this topic is worthy of an hour of discussion among, frankly, probably a very expensive group of people, and the opportunity where their opportunity cost of time is quite high. So we've got to make the business case for why that session is important in the first place. And you can't just leave it up to your mobilizer or your champion or your key stakeholder to make that business case. You're probably going to have to prime the pump and put together some bullets on why is this session important. And in that same email, you have to communicate like what's going to happen at this session. So we're going to get together, and based on working with other companies like you, we have found it's really helpful before going down a track of building out this kind of capability. It's important to level set on what we're trying to do with this in the first place, such that we can ensure that a better likelihood of success. So for a short amount of time, maybe 60 minutes, we're going to get in the room and we're going to talk about this problem and figure out the right solution, and then talk about perhaps a little bit whether or not this is the right supplier. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to start here. So everyone needs to come to the table having done this pre-read, whatever that might be. So you give a purpose for the session. You give a broad agenda. Then you lay out in a little bit more detail how the agenda is going to flow, different roles that people are going to play, any pre-read that's involved. And the first thing you are looking for is, can we even get this thing on the books? Because that's actually a qualifier, right? So if I can't get the buying group into a meeting like this, whether I'm present or not, it's like you can't get them to buy if they can't even align on having a conversation on what they're trying to do. Now, at that conversation, at that stakeholder alignment workshop, there's a whole process that around a set of design principles. But the design principles are all about essentially opening and narrowing thinking, quite closely related to prompting and bounding, right? So if we think ultimately what we're trying to do is get them to buy and buy from us, so we've got to make sure that this entire thing runs on sort of a funnel, so it gets narrower and narrower and narrower towards our unique strengths. But we got to start at the wide end of that funnel with, all right, what are the different problems we could solve, and what are the different root causes of that problem? So you go through first an opening exercise, like let's get it all on the table, and then let's go through a narrowing exercise. So opening and then narrowing, open, narrow, open, narrow. We're going to do it's almost like a bow tie, right? So once you put them all together, it kind of looks like a little string of bow ties. But we open up like, what are the different problems we can solve? And then we narrow to the ones that are top priority. Once we land on that set of problems that we're going to solve, all right, what are the root causes? Let's have an opening session that is a broadening and expansive, think of a brainstorming. What are the different root causes for that problem? Okay, once we've got as many as we can on the table, let's narrow down to the root causes that are worthy of our attention, the ones that we think are the 80-20 rule, the 20% of the root causes that are going to get 80% of the benefit, give 80% of the benefit if we can solve them. Once we identify the root causes, then let's have an opening session on what are the tactics we might employ to address those root causes. And then you have a narrowing around, okay, of those different tactics that we could deploy in order to solve those root causes that we've now prioritized, what are the best tactics? And once you've identified the right tactics, then you keep going with, all right, what are the metrics? And then you can get on to targets and timelines. And the whole idea is, as with you there as a facilitator, you're guiding this conversation closer and closer and closer to a point where they look at the end and say, wow, this is what we need to do. Do we all agree? Yep. Who can help us with this? And hopefully you're there in a position to say, let me show you how at least we can help you with that, and how maybe I think we can help you with that better than anyone else. Now, if in the process of that stakeholder workshop, the thing takes a weird left turn and goes in a completely different direction such that you're not part of that journey anymore at all, well, that's a bummer, I agree, but at least now you know. Now you know that you're probably not top priority for this group, and that you're going to be the number one solution to their number 3 problem, and this is probably something that should be put on the back burner. In other words, whether you can get people in the room to have the conversation, and then the actual results of the conversation, every one of those is an interim qualification metric. And the people who run these workshops, sometimes they're sales reps, usually they're someone who's quite skilled at facilitation, maybe a sales engineer or a value engineer, or it's someone on a centralized team that's brought in at least for the biggest accounts. Sometimes it's even a third party. Maybe these sessions are over a virtual call. Ideally, they're in a room together where you can actually make it more of a workshop and run them across 4 to 5 hours. That's a huge ask. And so sometimes you may ask yourself, well, Brent, what do I do if I can't even get my customer stakeholders together in a room to have that kind of conversation? How in the world am I supposed to close a deal if I can't even get them to talk to each other in the first place? Exactly. That's exactly right. And so that's got to be our goal. How can we find ways to get those customer stakeholders to talk not so much to us, but to each other, but then specifically in a structured fashion around the problem and then the objective, and then the tactics, and then the metrics and the targets and the timelines. And the degree that we can facilitate that, we can guide that conversation closer to our benefit. There's a number of companies out there doing really great work around customer alignment workshops. We actually dealt with this in the Challenger Customer book. There's a half a chapter on this towards the back, which I got to be honest, I'd forgotten we'd put in there, and it's really great stuff. So take a look at that. And go out and experiment a little bit. See if you can get your customers in a room, virtually, in real life, in reality, to have that conversation, because that's ultimately what needs to happen to thread that deal in a multi-fashion sort of way. If you want to multi-thread, that's the way you got to do it.